Salient. All of our programs, for the most part, for the 150th up to this point, have been really focused on the battle action and the orientation of the troops on the battlefield and the flow of battle that occurred here 150 years ago. This evening, or this late afternoon, we're going to do a little bit of that, but primarily we're going to focus on what is known as the Mule Shoe Salient, a series of Confederate entrenchments, earthworks, breastworks, defenses that were built here at Spotsylvania and essentially defined the fighting from May 10th onward here at Spotsylvania. May 10th, at least through May 10th through 13th. And it became the focus for the Army of the Potomac on May 12th. And what became 22 hours of constant close contact and even hand-to-hand fighting that occurred here because of these earthworks. What we're going to do is we're going to start here, which is the base of the Mule Shoe Salient, and we're going to walk up its western face. We have handouts which have been passed around. Peter Glyer, one of our volunteers in the bright vest, has them. There's just simply one sheet. On the front you will see a map that was made by United States Army engineers in 1867. They came back here and they took detailed measurements of the earthworks, and they surveyed the battlefields. These maps were to accompany the official reports that the officers had written about the battle after the fighting, and this map is a result of those raw measurements and surveys that they took here on the battlefield. So as far as I'm concerned, it's about as close as we can get to what earthworks had been constructed here, and we have blown up the Mule Shoe Salient. The numbers on the map indicate the stops we will be making. So we are at stop number 1 here on the map, and like I said, we will be working our way up the western face of the salient, making stops along the way, talking about the earthworks, talking about their construction, the when, the how, the why. And we just want you to, a couple safety things to take care of. We are going to be walking along the roads. For those who are on the tour that we just finished, there are not going to be any streams we're jumping across. We will be going into the woods briefly, but only about 30 yards in the woods, along a trail. So we're not going to do any bushwhacking. But please be careful, because even though your cars have filled up Anderson Drive here, heading north, we will be passing beyond our parked cars along the park road, so just look out for the vehicles coming down. Also, equally as important, as far as I'm concerned, is the preservation, not only of yourselves, but of the earthworks here in front of us. The earthworks, the mounds that you see, there are 14 miles of earthworks inside National Park Service Spotsylvania Courthouse battlefield. 14 miles of earthworks that the soldiers dug 150 years ago, and they still survive. Today, they're in many cases just small little speed bumps on the landscape, but they are fragile. We will not have these forever. They're earthen, they will erode, but we're trying to preserve them as long as we can. And the best way we can do that is to keep from walking on them. So when you see these mounds, and they look like good things to stand on to get a vantage point for our tours, please think twice and refrain from walking on them. So like I said, we're going to be talking about the Mule Shoe Salient, its construction. A lot of it still is visible and retained here on the battlefield. And so in addition to preservation, another word that we'll probably and perhaps use this afternoon, Beth's going to laugh at this, is Pictionary. And the reason for that is we inherited these earthworks in the 1930s. So between the 1864 and the 1930s, we don't know what happened on this ground. The farmers who were here when the battles began returned and tried to reclaim their fields where these earthworks ran. In the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps had a camp here in the middle of the Mule Salient. They built these roads. They, along with the War Department, eventually the National Park Service, built these roads, put in parking areas, put in trails, all sorts of things that were undocumented. So the landscape has changed. And so when we look at the earthworks today, there are a lot of things with these mounds, where they are, what way they are oriented, that we don't today understand. The soldiers themselves do not leave detailed accounts oftentimes. And so in talking with my boss, John Hennessy, who many of you have heard, he used the sort of the analogy of Pictionary. If you play Pictionary, that is sort of like charades, only you're drawing something and people are trying to guess what it is. The earthworks today, like Pictionary, at one time, at a specific time, it made sense. But you walk away and come back 150 years later and you look at it, what on earth is that? And that's, in many cases, what we're dealing with here. Earthworks that we still don't understand exactly what their intention were, or was. So anyway, with that, we're going to explain what we do know and show you the Mule Salient, at least the west face of it, this afternoon. Now, in 1864, field fortifications were really nothing new in the Civil War. The armies had been building trenches, earthworks, barricades. In fact, going back to June 27, 1862, the Battle of Gaines Mill outside Richmond, Virginia, the Union 5th Corps that was there did put up barricades and defenses on the banks of Bosun Creek. Robert E. Lee attacked those defenses. Those are quite possibly the first instance of earthworks or trenches being built on a battlefield and under pressure from the enemy. So earthworks in 1864 were nothing new. All right, thank you. Earthworks were nothing new in 1864. They had been used. We see them at Fredericksburg immediately after the battle. The earthworks are being constructed. Even before the battle, some of the artillery are protected. The cannons are protected by earthworks. Chancellorsville, the soldiers are digging in during the battle at Chancellorsville. Those earthworks still exist. Gettysburg, up on Culp's Hill, there are barricades, earthworks, defenses that are still up there today. And then, perhaps most importantly, the non-battle of Mine Run in November of 1863. The Union Army in November of 1863 had crossed the Rapidan River in the same places, or same place, one of the same places. They would cross here in May of 1864, turned west into Orange County, Virginia, and along the banks of Mine Run, Robert E. Lee and the Confederates constructed tremendous earthwork defenses. So impressive were these works, the Army of the Potomac chose not to attack them. The fact that the Army of the Potomac chose not to attack those earthworks, could influence, and did influence, the thought process on the battlefield. If you have those defenses, obviously you can influence how a battle is fought and what would occur. May 5th, 1864, up in the wilderness, Richard Ewell arrives with his 2nd Corps up on the edge of Saunders Field. The battle did not occur for an hour or so. What were Ewell's men doing? They were building trenches. Now, when we say trenches, they go by the term earthworks or breastworks. Breastworks because they were typically breast high, earthworks because they were earthen. And the way they were constructed is not really the way we have a tendency to view trenches or entrenchments. They didn't start at ground level and go down. They started at ground level and they went up, cutting down trees, stacking them up on top of one another, digging down behind that barricade, throwing the dirt over and banking it up against the front. So you do drop elevation somewhat, but it's predominantly a barricade that is built breast high. And so what we have today, these small, gentle mounds, are very difficult to comprehend what a trench during the Civil War looked like. On the back of the map, you have a photograph of some of the Confederate trenches that were built here at Spotsylvania to give an indication. You can see the man standing in them and how high they were. We have a reconstructed section right behind you to give an indication as well of this log barricade with earth thrown behind them. But in on May 5th, 1864, up at Wilderness, when the Union Army attacks across Saunders Field, they're not hitting trenches like you see there. They're hitting what were referred to as hasty earthworks, a basic barricade of trees and perhaps some digging. The earthworks that you see in that photo, they are a result of days of occupation, and that's what influences Spotsylvania. The armies are here for almost 2 weeks at Spotsylvania, and so the defenses, the earthworks, the trenches get extremely deep and extremely elaborate. When the armies moved down here to Spotsylvania, May 7th, they began moving down. May 8th, for those of you that started earlier today with the attacks on Laurel Hill, the Confederates did have some of those hasty earthworks and trenches up. But there, it's still somewhat of an open field engagement as the Federals are coming across the field, Confederates in a fixed position, however. Not the deep earthworks, the substantial earthworks that the Mule Salient that we're going to talk and see that they became. And again, that's because by the time the Union Army focuses its attention on the Mule on May 12, 1864, the Confederates have had 2 to 3 days to build and improve these earthworks. And we always say, for a soldier, anything you can put between you and the enemy, it's a good thing. And so they were digging and building and very, very busy. So these earthworks that were constructed as part of the Mule Salient were extremely strong. We are standing at where the Mule began. Off here, behind me, the earthworks begin off to the south and west, and they begin to head north. This is the beginning of the Mule Salient. We are at its base. The Mule earthworks continue off to the north before they curve around. And we'll explain why they were built in that shape. The soldiers refer to it as appearing like a mule shoe. It is a salient, an upside down W. General James A. Walker of the Stonewall Brigade, commanding 5 Virginia regiments, when he pulled in here on the evening of May 8, 1864 in the dark, off to the, just slightly off to the north, he said, as soon as night put an end to the combat, axes, picks, and shovels were sent for. And along the whole line through the night, the men worked like beavers. And the crash of falling trees, the ring of axes, and the sound of the spade and shovel were heard. Trees were felled and piled upon each other, and a ditch dug behind them, with the earth out of it thrown against the logs. The limbs and tops of the trees are cut off from the trunks were used to form abatis, by placing them in front of the breastworks with the sharpened points towards the enemy. A private from Mississippi, describing the construction of earthworks here, said, a bunch of leaves, a tuft of grass, loose dirt, rotten trees, anything that had the semblance of firmness went into the little trenches that we made and laid down in. We dug dirt with tin pans, tin cups, knives, rails, anything. So the men were digging with anything they could get their hands on, building this sort of stacked barricade of logs and throwing the dirt on the other side to increase its thickness and resiliency to the enemy's fire. Abatis, which was used here, abatis was, as described, the tops or the tree limbs being ripped off from the trunks, sharpened, and put out front, creating essentially like barbed wire during World War I. A barricade out in front to slow down and break up an attack while you're safe behind your barricade, your earthworks and entrenchments, and firing into those men trying to fight their way and scramble through the abatis. The construction of the Mule Salient is something that the Confederates debated and talked about long afterward. There were no combat engineers during the Civil War. The construction of earthworks for the Confederates, the construction of earthworks was left up to the men. You did not have engineers to come in and do the work for you. And when you build and create a salient in a military position, it's a big negative. The reason for that is you have a bulge in the line that can be attacked from different locations. If the enemy gets inside your position, then they can fire in any direction into the rear of you trying to protect that salient. converging fire, enfilading fire, attack from multiple locations. It's not really what you want to do. And we'll explain why this mule shoe salient existed. The Confederates did have pioneers. Pioneers were men who were pulled out of their units, and they carried shovels and picks and eggs, and they would do digging. They were primarily designed to clear obstructions from roads, bury the dead, build bridges, that type of thing. They could be used for the construction of earthworks. But when it came to the design of earthworks, exactly where to build them, that was not the pioneers' responsibility. The Confederates did have an engineer corps, but the engineer corps by 1864 was fledgling and really didn't have any impact on the battlefield, not here in the Overland Campaign. The Confederate government had created an engineer corps in 1861, but it only consisted of 200 men. In 1863, engineer regiments were raised from within the armies. There was one regiment that was being raised for the Army of Northern Virginia, but after his losses at Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee decided he couldn't spare any men for the engineer regiment, so recruiting stopped. On April 12, 1864, the 1st Confederate Engineer Regiment joined Lee's army. It had, there was one engineer regiment for 159 infantry regiments. So therefore it wouldn't have much impact. And looking at pretty much what they did, they primarily built roads, cleared roads, and that type of thing. Not laying out earthwork lines. If they didn't lay out the earthworks and they didn't lay out, determine where these earthworks were run, and if they didn't create the mule shoe salient, who did? Primarily staff officers. Staff officers for those troops who were coming into line here on May 8th. Each division, corps, and army commander was allotted one engineer officer on his staff. Their primary job, survey, reconnaissance, map making, road and ford improvements, quote, may be employed on any other duty whatsoever, and maybe supervise trench construction. Here at Spotsylvania, the engineer and staff officers for the generals, the brigadier generals, the brigades, the divisions who came on the line, they appear to have been the ones responsible for choosing the ground and supervising the trench construction. Just north of us here, Junius Daniels, North Carolina Brigade, came into position on the evening of May 8th. A sergeant in the 45th North Carolina of that brigade described how they determined their line in the dark. A sergeant from each regiment of our brigade was called for and assembled at brigade headquarters. I was detailed as one. We were all placed in charge of Captain William L. London. Captain London carried us forward in the dark and selected what appeared to be the highest point of a low ridge between the lines. He posted us one at a place along the crest of this low ridge until he had posted each guide about the length of a regiment apart, giving each instructions to remain in the pine thicket where we were placed until we heard the signal come down the line from our right, and then to take up and repeat it as often as it came until the regiment came up and formed on us. After what seemed to me a long time, I heard away on my right coming down the line a low hello. This passed down the line and continued until we heard the tramp of the regiments as they came up and formed upon us. Very convoluted way to say for Daniels, North Carolinians, that a staff officer, Captain London, who prior to the war was a merchant, had no engineer training, selected their position on the battlefield and determined where they would dig their trenches by simply taking the sergeants out, placing them in the woods upon what in the dark he could determine might be high ground. And then as they yelled to one another, their regiments would come up through the woods until they found them, and then they would establish their line. So that's how Daniels' brigade determined it. On the far right that evening, General Edward Johnson's division formed. There, Lieutenant William W. Old, who was a volunteer aide-de-camp, again, no engineer training, he moved the division into line at night without guides or lights, moved them forward until he could see federal campfires in the distance. At that point, we don't need to go any closer. And he determined that he was occupying the brow of a ridge. He was on high ground. The campfires that he could see were below the plane of his position. And he deflected his line backwards so that he would avoid running into those campfires. So that's how the Confederates determined this line in the dark. Avoiding Federal campfires, determining in the dark by men who were not engineers and had no training where they were. And hopefully they were on high ground. And so when morning broke on May 9th, they discovered that they were creating this salient, this bulge in the Confederate line, and something that, if attacked, was going to be difficult to defend. So that's the beginning of the Mule Shoe Salient here. And what we're going to do now is follow me. We're going to take a walk on up the road, and we're going to make a stop at a line of earthworks that cuts across to the east, across the salient, and talk about what their role was here. And if you look on your map, you will see that as stop number 2. But we will go up there, talk about that, and then continue to work our way up the western face of the salient.
Why didn't they wear a morning so simply because come morning, the Federals could attack Dawn, and they wanted to get the position already ready, already prepared. Are you Eric?
To orient where we are with regard to the tour we did earlier, the 1 to 3 o'clock tour that we did. If you take your map of the Mule Shoe Salient and hold it so that the apex, or the point, tip of it, which is tour stop number 6 on our map, is off to our left, off to the north, and then you look at number 3, and you go straight to the west, about halfway into those woods. That's where we were earlier this afternoon, 1 to 3 o'clock. So that ought to give you an indication as to where we were for those of you who were on the earlier tour. All right, so back to the Mule Shoe Salient and its construction here. There are a couple different sort of theories as to why earthworks and trenches became so prominent in 1864 and during the Civil War on the battlefield here, beginning with the Wilderness and all the way through to Petersburg. Sort of a traditional line of thought has been that it was technology of weaponry. The rifle became the primary weapon in the hands of the soldier, and with that increase in distance and accuracy, casualties mounted, and that they were utilizing tactics standing shoulder to shoulder, the linear movements on the battlefield, that the technology was outdistancing the tactics, and thus higher casualties, thus the rise of protection on the battlefield. But it seems more recent discussion is that the rise of earthworks comes from the style of warfare that we're seeing in 1864. In other words, the daily constant pressure. No longer do you have the Battle of Chancellorsville or Gettysburg, where you fight for a few days, the armies disengage, separate themselves by great distances, refit, reorganize, and then a couple months later come at each other again. Beginning in May, on May 5th, 1864, all the way through June to Petersburg, and for the remainder of the war in Virginia, the armies are in constant contact. And so that gives rise to the need for these defenses, to put between you and the enemy, and the need for these elaborate defenses, because you are in constant contact with the enemy. And that seems to be, as far as I'm concerned personally, probably a little more logical, because earthworks did exist before 1864, but it's beginning with the Wilderness in Spotsylvania that they become what we know as trench warfare during the Civil War. Now, the anatomy of the salient, looking at your map, the red lines indicate Confederate earthworks, and you'll see from stop 1 to stop 6, that is the western or left face of the salient, and then the red begins to bend back towards its base. The salient was about 1,800 yards wide at the base, and from the tip or apex to the base, it's about 1,320 yards. So a fairly substantial bulge in the Confederate position. Inside of it were two farms. You can see them on there, McCool and Harrison. McCool would eventually become Edward Allegheny Johnson's headquarters, division commander, and Richard Ewell's division. And then the Edgar Harrison house, which is the grove of trees in front of us, and you might be able to see bits of stone to indicate a foundation, that becomes Robert E. Lee's headquarters. So Lee's headquarters is in the middle, or inside the salient. One Confederate officer suggested that the bulge in the line added an additional 2 miles to the Confederate position here at Spotsylvania. So if you look at this large bulge, which again is a huge negative because it can be attacked from 3 sides, it's subject to converging fire. If the enemy gets inside, he's staring at the backs of everybody, of the defenders for the most part, who are up on the line. It is a strong negative, and it adds 2 miles to your position, according to that staff officer. Lieutenant Oscar Hinrichs, who was Richard Ewell's, the Confederate Second Corps, they're the ones that created the salient. Ewell's Corps, Lieutenant Oscar Hinrichs was Ewell's engineer officer, and there is no indication that he had any great issues with the salient after its construction. His diary exists and is soon to be published, but in it, he doesn't really say much about the construction of earthworks here. Johnson, Edward Allegheny Johnson, bulked up the defense of the salient come the morning at the tip or the apex, at the very tip of the salient with artillery. You bring in cannons, you bring in artillery, you strategically place them along the salient, and the belief was that the position would be strong, so long as artillery was in place. So for those of you thinking forward to May 12th, that's very important. So long as artillery is in place, the Confederates believed that the salient in this position was strong. Why would artillery be important? You load that artillery with canister, and the enemy coming at you, you can put out tremendous firepower from behind those earthworks and those defenses. So as long as we've got the cannons, the big guns along the line, it should be, hopefully, strong. The reactions to the salient. Colonel Thomas H. Carter, a Virginia artilleryman, said, "It was a wretchedly defective line in a military sense. It was only kept because of the work done upon it and the belief that our troops entrenched could never be driven out." A soldier in the 12th Georgia Infantry said, "The works were imperfect owing to a lack of an engineer competent to make a correct alignment." Captain William J. Seymour, staff officer for Hayes, Louisiana Brigade, he said, "Our men did not like it at all. It was liable to be enfiladed by artillery and would be a dangerous trap to be caught in should the line be broken on the right or the left." But the belief was that as long as there was artillery in place, this position could be held, and it was strong. The other thing is the salient is a negative, but once it is broken, the defenders do have somewhat of an advantage, and that is the ability to maneuver interior lines. If it's broken off to the east, you can send troops from here heading in that direction. You can reinforce yourself to some extent rather quickly should it be broken. Lee knew about it. Obviously, his headquarters was placed right in the middle of it. Lee understood that the Mule Shoe salient was here, and it was not something that he was terribly pleased about, but the men had dug it, and it was strong so long as the artillery was in place. But they did take additional steps to improve it. We're looking right here at one of those. This low line of earthworks right here that runs north and kind of curves off to the west. If you look at your map there on stop number 2, you will see that line running from west to east. This was a reserve line, an interior defense, and it was constructed by troops under Brigadier General John B. Gordon, who was commanding Jubal Early's division of Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps. The construction of this line was to create an interior line that should the enemy break through, you do have another defensive position. You can stack your reserves behind it, you can use it should the enemy actually break through. And as it turns out, the salient would prove to be rather defective for the Confederates and a difficult position to hold, first beginning on May 10th and then on May 12th. And to see where that defect is and what happens, follow me on up. We'll allow the cars behind us to move, and we'll head on up to a small salient inside the large salient.
All right. Thanks, Jack.
Oh, that's cold. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah. He didn't have it. That's
Come in here and work.
There, a slight bulge, ever so slight, as it bulges to the west. We are at what is known as Dole's Salient. And as you look off to your left, off to the south, from which we came, you will certainly see that the earthworks coming up, paralleling the road we were on, at this point, bulge out and swing all around to the north. This is a salient that is within a salient. We have the Mule Shoe Salient, and then along its faces, the east and west, we have additional small little changes. It's not perfectly straight along the west face of the salient. Where we are now, which again is number 3, this was built and occupied by 3 Georgia regiments under the command of Brigadier General George Doles. Why this salient exists, not really sure. Why this bulge here, right here, occurs. You'll notice, obviously, I'm standing below you, but we don't know how much of the road construction in the 1930s may have created an elevation there, and that you're sitting and standing on. But if you look out over in front of us, what do you notice about the topography? It's level, it rises, but then what happens after it rises? It drops down, correct. So its position here could have something to do with the topography in front of us. Maybe it was pushed out, getting closer to that high ground. Maybe in the evening of May 8th, maybe perhaps Dole's Georgians, as they came into this position, this seemed to be the high ground in the darkness. I'm not sure, but they do create this sort of, this actual salient within the salient. Out in front, it was open fields for about 150 to 200 yards, actually beyond what is today the wood line. The historic wood line was pushed a little more back, probably about 30 or 40 yards into the woods there. In front of these trenches, they constructed abattis. They had the tree limbs that they took off the trees they knocked down to build the earthworks, to build the breastworks. They took the tree limbs off, stripped them of the leaves, sharpened them, and stacked them out in front. So that as the enemy, if they should attack, they would hit that abattis, it would slow them down, at which point Dole's infantry here could hopefully slaughter the enemy at the abattis. Just cut them down as they struggled to get through the defenses. I mentioned that the Confederates did not have really engineers to help them with tactical situations for the most part on the battlefield. The Union did have engineers, but they were also not utilized as much for the construction, laying out trenches or earthworks. But the Union did get a little more progressive with the use of their engineers on the battlefield as time went on. Dole's Salient here, for those of you that know the story of Spotsylvania, the Union Army did breach this location on the evening of May 10th, 1863. So the idea that this position was strong, perhaps impregnable, as long as you had artillery, was proven wrong on May 10th, 1864, 2 days from now. And if you, in 2 days, Saturday, we will be doing a program that focuses on the attack here that pierced Dole's salient and his line. The location chosen for that attack on May 10th was the result of a lieutenant in the U.S. Engineers on the other side. He scouted this face of the Mule Shoe, the western face of the Mule Shoe, and he determined that Dole's salient right here was the point of attack for May 10th. So an engineer on the other side could see the vulnerability of a salient. He could see that this was a point for attack. Maybe it was because of the salient that he chose it, but also because of the topography out in front, the ground dropping in front of it. As the enemy, the Union forces, advanced toward Dole's salient here, they could not be seen until they were almost right on top of the earthworks in this location. They could rush the position. So the engineers, whereas the Confederate engineers were having difficulty having an impact, the Union engineers on the other side certainly did. Defensible by artillery, there was artillery here on May 10th, but to the south, not at the point where the breakthrough occurred. They did strengthen this position. They built what were called traverses. Traverses are short extensions off the main line, trenches or breastworks that come back, creating sort of pens. So if the enemy gets in, you can fight over that as you're facing them at the breakthrough point, or as the Confederate, or if the enemy gets in, they can't just fire and sweep down your trench line. So there were some traverses. We'll talk about traverses a little later on. Another thing they did was they built a second parapet. There was, in addition to the front line, you see this rise right in front of us here. There was a trench behind a trench, or a breastwork behind a breastwork, doubling the strength of it. We walked through down there, and hopefully some of you noticed, there was a trench line that extended off of the main line at the base of the Dole's salient, or I should say the left end of it, that extends east and then shoots north. You'll see it on your map. And it is that line there at number 3 that pushes back, and when I say back, I mean to the east, and then it turns north and runs parallel to the main line. That is a secondary line. Again, you have a salient here, and you have another one within the Mule Shoe salient just to the north of us, which we'll talk about in a couple stops. This secondary line is built as a defense. If the enemy gets in, you have another line to fall back on to defend from. And if the enemy gets in, you can pin him in between these earthworks and these trenches. And so there is a secondary line behind to strengthen this position. And that does become important on May 10th, 1864, when the attacks come. When the attacks came on May 10th, it was close to sunset. The topography, the inherent issues with this position with regard to a bulge in a line, possibly taking fire from different sides. Goodwin Scott of the 12th Georgia Infantry wrote, "As soon as the enemy made a breach in the line, they poured through and turning right and left, commenced pouring a fire right down the line and also passing into our rear. We remained in a ditch until I saw the enemy shooting and capturing men within 40 yards of us. Some ran, taking the risks of being shot, while others remained and were taken prisoners." What he was doing was he was taking shelter in one of those pens created by the traverses. When the enemy got in, he got in that pen. Now he had a problem. The enemy's in your line, where do you go? You're not going over the earthworks to the, from the direction from which he came, but as you head to the rear, this is your defensive position. There is nothing back there, unless you can get to the second line. And so the problem is, once your position's overrun, you have to run the gauntlet of fire to escape, or as he said, remain where you are and be taken prisoners. So here at Dole's Salient, on this point, the Confederates perhaps seeing the problem with this bulge, and it's ever so slight. We'll see it at the bloody angle as we head up to the second to our last stop. These are slight but they are important changes in the face of the Muleshoe salient. And they do become targets, and on May 10th, 1864, this is where the attack came and where it broke through. Now, after the fighting here on May 10th, and I'll give away a little bit of my Beth and my tour on May 10th, the Federals ultimately fail. They're pushed back out, but after they're pushed back out, the Confederates realizing, we've been breached here, we need to do something. We need better protection, and they decide to take that protection not inside, but outside of the salient. And so if you'll follow me, we'll take a brief walk into the woods and see what they did to protect this location that had been breached once, to make sure, hopefully, it doesn't get breached a second time. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to head down the road to Peter, who's already positioning himself at the bollards for the parking area for Dole's Salient. So walk on down, and we will cross through the gap in the earthworks there and move out into the woods. We are directly in front of Dole's Salient. So on May 10th, 1864, a cobbled together, essentially division of Union troops came rushing up the slope that is in front of us, and about where we are is where the actual wartime tree line was. So right here would have been the tree line. So they're coming through the woods. They reach this point from here on, for the most part. From this point, essentially, it's all open field to the earthworks, to Dole's Salient. So they break through and show that the salient is not impregnable, and they get in. They are thrown out. They fight for an hour or so inside the earthworks, but the Confederates, because of that ability to use interior lines and pull troops from various locations, because that secondary line had been built and curved around behind Dole's Salient, there are additional defenses. And so the Confederates are able to get behind that secondary line, bring more troops in from various sectors, and the lack of Union reinforcements, they push the Federal attackers back out. The next day, according to one of the staff officers, Confederate staff officers, who was on this part of the line, he said, speaking about the breakthrough on May 10th, he said, "This affair impressed us with the necessity of strengthening our line. And next morning, May 11th, the men fell to work with increased energy, particularly on the abattis, the importance of which in detaining and throwing into confusion an enemy within point-blank range they now fully appreciated." So they began strengthening their line, and he said primarily the abattis, putting those entangled tree limbs out in front to slow the enemy down. Additional improvements were made. It's our belief and opinion that this is a result of those improvements. This is a Confederate position, but it's outside of the salient. The enemy came through here once before. Could they come through here a second time? They broke through once, so could they break through a second time? And so we believe that these earthworks, and they're very low here in front of us, they were probably not terribly substantial, but we do believe that this was essentially a position to act as an early warning system. You put your troops out here. If the enemy's coming, you'll have enough time to let those inside the earthworks, the main line behind, know that they're coming. So we believe that this line of Confederate earthworks is an extension of the Muleshoe Salient in providing additional protection and security at the point at which the Federals did break through on May 10th, 1864. As we head back, we're going to follow the trail that we came out. As we head back, you're going to see what looks like an earthwork immediately to the right, but it is actually facing the Confederate position. Whatever ditch, the deep ditch that side is on, that's the defender's position. So this deep ditch in front of us indicates that the earthworks are facing that direction. We're going to pass that small little, about 8 to 10 foot ditch or trench there, and it's facing that direction. We have no indication that the Federals built anything through here. There's only one of them. There aren't multiple ones. So for that position, that trench, that anomaly on the ground there, we say Pictionary. We're not sure what it is. We don't know if it had a reason, if it had a purpose. We don't know if the Civilian Conservation Corps built something out here. We don't know if the farmer who owned the land after the war decided to dig a ditch out here to throw his trash in. But there are things like that going on in the woods. But when we see something like this, which is fairly long, or if there were more of those small ones scattered along the same line, that would be an indication. But the purpose for coming out here was just to see this here in front of us as a post-Union breakthrough of the Mule Shoe Salient, a response by the Confederates, realizing that even though they have artillery in there, it is not impregnable, and taking steps to reinforce and protect themselves by putting something out here that they can put men in who can let them know if the enemy's coming. So with that, let's head on back through the trail, and Beth will take us on to the next stop.
My name, if anyone has forgotten since our introduction, is Beth Parnitza, and you might have noticed that Eric and I decided to go ahead and split the tour halfway. So we've been listening to him for the first half, and you'll be stuck with me for the last half of our program. As a quick administrative note, one of the things that we decided to do just today is actually to take you to our last stop that we just did in the woods. So it's not marked on your handouts because we printed those off a good while ago. So we're just now getting to stop number 4 if you're trying to orient yourself on your map. Now, one of the interesting things, that I would say is what most influences how the Mule Shoe Salient is created and why it's created the way it is. And the first one is topography. And the second one would be the position of the enemy. So right here, let's take a look around at our surroundings. What can you see? If you look down the line, you've got a great view, right? If you look up the line, not so much. And what's more, if you start to look around, so firstly we've got a decided disadvantage here because you have low visibility, but also because we're in such low ground. If you look, we even have a nice drainage ditch here. If you look on the other side of the road, you have another drainage ditch because this area has a tendency to get very wet. If you've been here a couple days ago, you would have almost certainly seen standing water in the trench lines on the other side of the road. So this low ground is going to have quite an impact on how the line is constructed. Here in the low ground is not a good place to be if you are a soldier. Firstly, your experience is going to be vastly worse than the people who are up the slope, of course, because you're getting all the water that drains down, firstly. And there is a lot of water on the battlefield. Rains are going to begin on the Spotsylvania Courthouse battlefield area during the battle on May 11th, and they will continue. It's going to be an almost incessant rain for more than a day. It's rather less than ideal, both militarily and personally. Rufus Dawes, a Union soldier here, described also from the layout of the works how that impacts how the water drains in and how awful your experience actually is. He described the Confederate works by saying they had constructed their works by digging an entrenchment about 4 feet deep in which at intervals there were traverses to protect the flanks. This had the effect of making a row of cellars without drainage, and in them was several inches of mud and water. So if you were a poor soldier who got stuck in the low ground, you got stuck also with several inches of mud and water. And in the low ground, again, the water is going to drain down into these trenches and get caught in the different pens and traverses, which are built at right angles to the main line, primarily designed. So, of course, if you're attacked and your line is breached, you have a defensive position in which you can turn and meet the enemy. And these will become extremely important as the battle develops. But to the soldiers spending, say, 2 days out here before the fighting really develops at Spotsylvania Courthouse, those are going to be miserable places that block the water and actually trap them in pens. It's going to create really awful experiences, especially on May 12th, which is noted to have rain all day. So again, it begins on May 11th, continues all day May 12th, and those of you who are from the area remember what 3 days of incessant rain felt like and did to our area. It caused a lot of flooding and a lot of really misery But one man wrote from the 5th Virginia, "When I came to," he'd been wounded on the field, "when I came to, I crawled to a puddle of water through which men had been walking and fighting all day, and drank. All I wanted was water, regardless of how dirty. There was mud, blood, and brains in this puddle." Another man in the 1st South Carolina, probably stationed just a little ways up the line from where we currently are, he said, "I was splashed all over with brains and blood. In stooping down or squatting to load, the mud, blood, and brains mingled would reach up to my waist, and my head and face were covered or spotted with the horrid paint." So you can tell there's going to be a vast difference in the experience here in the low ground along the line as opposed to the experience much farther up on the high ground. And it's exacerbated again by the very construction of the line, which traps the water, traps all of this gore into huge, really awful puddles that are created here. But this means also something of a new lifestyle for the soldiers who are spending now every waking hour in these field fortifications, in these trenches. As Eric mentioned earlier, this is a new thing to the armies, to the soldiers who are fighting here. They're not used to spending days after days in the trenches. The constant fire again in the close proximity of the enemy is going to force these men to start living somewhat underground. And physically, their experience therefore becomes different. You have members of the Stonewall Brigade who will stretch their tents across the trenches to create canopies that they'll take shelter within during this battle. The tents probably taken actually from the 6th Corps in the wilderness. And you have small practicalities that you might get used to in camp life that are just utterly lost. McHenry Howard, one of the staff officers out here, described, "After a trip to a field hospital on May 11th, which gave him a slight break, I had the luxury of a change of underclothing, having been marching and lying in or near the trenches with the same clothing on for a week." Now keep in mind that as a staff officer, Howard is going to get some luxuries that a lot of the men here are not going to enjoy. So he's thrilled about his change of underclothing after several days. He says lying in or near the trenches with the same clothing on for a week, and he's already unhappy. But keep in mind that most of these men are not going to really get a chance to change their clothes covered in mud, blood, and other gore for several days. They're suffering from the constant stress, the constant contact with the enemy, and also the mud and the water here. Another man wrote, "I am nearly dead with fatigue and want of sleep, having had nothing but short naps of a few minutes' duration for the last 3 days and nights. We lay all day and night in the breastworks, in mud 5 inches deep, with every kind of shot and shell whistling over us, among us, in us, and about us, so that it was as much as your life was worth to raise your head above the works." So this is going to give rise to essentially a new lifestyle for soldiers in the Army, in both armies, as they're digging in. And it's not necessarily a pleasant transition for them. But it's also going to be mentally different. These field fortifications, as we've alluded to, are taking steps to a different kind of war. A different kind of war that we see starting at the Wilderness, continuing at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and is only going to continue as these men start to adjust to living in even more elaborate trenches down at Cold Harbor and Petersburg. They're going to be more elaborate, perhaps slightly more comfortable, but they're also going to be in them for a longer duration. And this is a kind of warfare, a kind of lifestyle that will really start to wear on the men. So if you join us again for the remainder of our programs, if you head down to Richmond, head down to Petersburg, you're going to notice this trend. The men are exhausted, the men are not getting much rest, they're adapting to this different lifestyle, and it's not exactly very pleasant. The stress, the exhaustion is all going to wear on them as time passes. But we should also, as we're looking here in the low ground, consider the importance of the high ground. So you look around, and again, your visibility below us is very good. The visibility above us is not good. This is not exactly the sort of place that you would necessarily want to position your line, or you would want to do so with something in mind to help to cover it. Here in the low ground, you're also very close to the enemy. Eric might have mentioned at our last stop just how close in proximity the Confederate lines are here to the 6th Corps lines just opposite them. This is going to lead these men to build these trenches here in the low ground because they're simply too close to the enemy to push them any farther out. But they need something to help cover. There's a thought that perhaps Dole's Salient or even the west angle, the bloody angle up here, are designed to do that. However, they don't. Dole's Salient, you really don't have a great view of the field up here. as we looked at the topography down that way, you noticed you could not see up the Confederate line. You really could not cover this area. From the west angle, to some degree, you can, looking down, but you also, again, it impresses upon you to stand here why you need to hold the high ground with your entrenchments. And so as we continue on up to our next stop, to that higher ground, and take a look at just what your earthworks can be if you're following the high ground and keep this terrain in mind. We're going to head on up the path just a little way.
Let's knock it over. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Second to none, fifth to fight, should be soon, and powder too.